Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Hormonally Speaking. We've got a special episode for you today that is, to me, I wanted to speak with this guest because she's had such a fascinating journey in terms of her own hormonal health and all the sort of ups and downs that she's experienced within our medical system, and how that took her to a different place in her own life and her own work, and the journey that got her to where she is today, and the kind of work that she's doing in supporting women and cycling beings in the world now. So I'm super excited to talk with Tiffany Narron, who is a writer, poet, postpartum and bereavement doula living in the mountains of North Carolina on Cherokee ancestral land. She holds a bachelor's degree in communications from the University of North Carolina in Asheville, as well as a master's certificate in narrative medicine, and brings countless hours of training and lived experience to her work in writing, compassionate communication, and bereavement support. She holds monthly women's grief circles and works with clients individually, creating space to allow the more painful stories of the body forward. She blends poetry, breathwork, narrative medicine, somatic centering, and an integration techniques alongside creative healing arts modalities to meet her community in their grief, creating a warm, nurturing, safe space for witness and integration. You can find out more at tiffanynarron.com. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, as I was just saying, I think that you have what I want to kind of call a unique experience, and yet probably a lot of people out there have a somewhat similar experience in navigating, our healthcare system and trying to figure out what's going on with our bodies from a reproductive stance. So let's just start off with your story and your history and kind of what got you here today.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's impossible to, we were just saying it's impossible to separate that out of my own story, because my own story, first, as is true for so many people, was kind of the breaking open of this, like crossing a threshold, this, realizing the ways that I wasn't met and wasn't seen and wasn't cared for was the ways that I really needed to like problem solve and understand how do we kind of bridge those divides, and how can I do that for myself, and then how can I do that in my community for others. And so I guess I can kind of go back so far, because my journey as a woman and my own like kind of hormonal path began when I was really young. And when I first got my cycle, when I was 15 years old, and they were really heavy and really intense. And my mom was so confused of just like, what do we do? Are we like feeding you Tylenol and letting you stay home from school? And then fast forward through the years of doing that, and then navigating what this looks like as I grow older, and then being diagnosed and then not diagnosed with endometriosis, and trying to wrap my head around what that means, with that being a very confusing journey, with some doctors naming it and recognizing it as very real, and other doctors saying, no, that's not at all, a real thing at all.
Wow. Can I ask you really quick before you go on?
Yeah.
The doctors that did diagnose you with endo, was that based symptomatically, or was it based surgically, or how did that go?
Yeah, so I had a gynecologist early in my life diagnose me with it based on symptoms and based on pelvic exams. Very real evidence that like I had a tissue. I can see it.
Gotcha.
And so she was kind of an early advocate for me, that made me feel like, okay, this can make sense now. There's at least a reason that this is happening to me, versus people that are just like, oh, I got my period and going on about their
Yeah.
day.
And you're like, how dare you?
Right. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So, and then I guess in the same right, other doctors looking at those same set of symptoms and saying, oh, well, this is totally normal, and take some Tylenol and get back out there,
It's just what it is to be a woman.
That's
Yeah.
what it is. Yeah. So, at some at one point it's clarifying and very validating. And then in the other half of that, very confusing, because it wasn't a shared agreement by doctors I was seeing in my young adulthood. So.
Yeah. And, I think the average is 8 years before a woman will get diagnosed with endometriosis, and I would say really just in the past couple of years, maybe 5 years, has the spotlight been on it enough for it to be a more common thing to talk to your OBGYN about, for them to look for and that kind of thing. So you've had years and years and years of women dealing with it, having no idea that they have it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. My grandmother, because we have a long line of women in my family that face similar hormonal issues. Every single woman in my family has had a hysterectomy.
Wow.
Every single one. My cousins, my aunts, my grandmother, everyone. So, there's been this kind of like, oh, me too. And also, when I talk to the elder women in my family, they're like, well, this talk wasn't a talk that we were having.
Right.
When
no
we were
discussions.
Yeah. You just, it was that like, oh, well, you're a woman, this is part of it.
Yeah. Oh man.
Purest, form of it. So, so grateful that we're in a time where there is a lot more awareness and advocacy, and there are a lot more women and administrating people coming to the table to say, I need answers. We need support. And a lot of funding around it too. So
finally that's starting to happen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So did you get to a point then where you were, okay, I'm officially do have endometriosis, or officially don't have endometriosis? What was the
I kind of accepted that at a certain point and was like, okay, this feels right for me, because all the signs and symptoms are there. And also, what do I do with it was still the bigger question of like, well, that's great and that's helpful, but even looking at all the endometriosis related information is like, there's no cure, there's surgery. To be kind of the only like
cure. As so many things with reproductive health, that kind of just comes down to just do surgery, just take it out.
Totally, which I've always been just really reluctant to do, as someone that thought I want to have children at some point in my life. I'd like to explore that. And I want to see a more holistic way of like, how can I sustainably move through this in my life and learn how to be with this set of circumstances that I have. And so, I found TENS devices and herbal treatments and started, walking the path of how do I sustainably meet myself with this set of symptoms,
Yeah. So then, at what point did things start to really shift and change for you, either sort of in the positive or negative way?
It's been like this kind of like circular, like a seasonal thing, where like the second I really feel like I've got it dialed in, then something happens. And I can't always pinpoint it, and there's like a disruption, and something is triggering that then all the symptoms are set off again, and periods worse, and all these things. The bloating is worse. Ovarian cysts are growing larger than they should. My gynecologist can detect them, and I'm back in that same like, oh shit, what do I, why is this happening again? I thought I had this dialed in. In 2019, there was a really clear, a strong two ovarian cysts had overgrown on my ovaries, and we're to the point where it was like, we're going to have to do surgery. We're talking about hysterectomy again. And like, no, like how is this possible, and what else can I do? I've been navigating this, and layer in that I'm 2 months pregnant. I was pregnant at the time, and so how do I navigate this with this new information? And the answers were still the same. The solutions were still the same of, well, we can do the surgery, or you can continue to, see how you do with this. We don't recommend.
So you had the cysts while you were pregnant?
Yes.
that was going on. Okay. Simultaneously. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
before, and then I got pregnant,
Right.
and
And then I'm sure because of the higher estrogen and everything that leads to
yeah,
growth.
hormones were
Yeah.
totally
Yeah.
wacko, and there was a lot of stress in that time, and it's kind of hard to separate out. It's like, you know, you're this is happening before, which is stressful, and you're
Yeah.
having to go to the doctor so much more, which causes more stress.
Sure.
Like,
Absolutely.
okay,
Yeah.
how do I get back into like maintain this balance in my body?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that is not an easy thing.
Right. Right. Yeah. So then what happened next?
Yeah, so then I was in and out of the hospital having these looked at, having the cyst looked at. I was in and out of the hospital just for appointments with my gyno and kind of checking on the pregnancy. And then they said, okay, we're going to do a laparoscopic surgery. It won't harm your pregnancy. It
Okay.
won't, this will all be okay. And so, you know, I felt confident in that, said, okay, let's just go this route. And when I went in for the laparoscopic surgery, I was just a wreck,
Yeah.
you know, of having to go through that process and not knowing, even though
Yeah.
there was reassurance, you'll be okay. And it had ended up being okay. The laparoscopic surgery, everything went fine. And I miscarried. And
After the surgery.
after the
Yeah.
surgery.
Mhm.
Yeah. And, you know, there's so many different reasons of
Right.
why and
Right.
how. It was in that early termination time at 2
Yeah.
months. And, you know, and I learned all of that later, but it was devastating and
Yeah.
didn't help kind of the processing of what just happened and why. And what do I do moving forward? You know, is
Yeah.
this like, is this something that's going to happen again? How can I break this cycle? I still had a lot of questions, maybe more questions, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I just want to pause for a moment for anybody listening that has had a miscarriage and what, an obviously heartbreaking experience that is when you want to have, a child. And then on top of the fact of you were already experiencing trauma, having
Yeah,
to go to the doctor that much, and I definitely can understand that and the PTSD that forms, right? Because you're like, it's not like you come out of there better most of the time, right? It's just kind of leads to more questions, and that's something that, we all need. If we go through an experience like that, it's like really being cognizant of the impact that it can have on us, right? And I know we don't all have access to therapy and everything, but to do what you can in order to get support in that process, because it really can impact you for the long term, right? If you're not able
absolutely.
to work with it and through it and process it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that was part of that confusion of just kind of being spit out of the medical system and like sent home. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, you know,
Yeah.
good luck,
Good
happy.
luck. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're like, well,
Mhm.
my body's still hurting and
Yeah.
I'm grieving, and I still don't fully understand how I move forward with this,
Right.
you
Right.
know.
Yeah.
So just all of the questions and what I later really identified as a lot of grief that I was holding and like didn't know how to process and who to process that with. Like it's not my medical team clearly,
Mhm.
but I
Right.
also wanted people that knew enough about those processes and knew enough about, you know, loss and all these different things to hold space with me.
Mhm.
So then
Mhm.
became this like journey of like, where do I find these people? And, you know, how am I connecting the dots for myself? How am I advocating
Mhm.
for myself? Uh,
Right. Right. And I just want to also acknowledge how hard it can be to be an advocate for yourself when you're in the middle of that process too, and it's like that's, my I think my dream for this country among many different things that we could shift and change is for everybody to have an advocate that goes into the hospital, right? Because particularly in our healthcare system now that is just packing the amount of patients per doctor and nurse and everything, and it's not, I don't even blame the doctors and nurses because it's a system that is putting way too much on them too, right?
yeah,
And And then, so we have so many people that are languishing because they don't have somebody to advocate for them. I went through that myself in the hospital, and also with others that have gone to the hospital where I've ended up being the advocate, So, I know for you, obviously advocating for yourself is kind of what got you to doing the work that you're doing now.
Yeah.
But, I'm sure that was really intense and tough for you to have to go through at that time.
Yeah, it was messy. It was just like a really messy, empowering,
Hmm.
weird mix of things that's like, oh, I found someone and I found this resource. And why do, I had to like really search,
Hmm.
and do a lot of searching in the middle of feeling really like disempowered and hurting in
Mm-hmm.
my body still, and trying really hard just to go through the motions of working and,
Hmm.
being back at work. And
Yeah.
because it's not.
Living, like taking care of life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And like it wasn't necessarily something where it was like, oh, you're given some time off work, like
Right.
a real passing. And so there was like this kind of unnamed grief. So it felt like I was in some weird liminal space. And yeah, and I had to really fight to find the things that I found,
Hmm.
for me, that was like,
Hmm.
oh, you know what endometriosis is, and you believe in advocating for folks with it,
Hmm.
and have real resources for folks with
Hmm.
endometriosis, or
Hmm.
you people here like know what it's like to lose a child and
Hmm.
early loss, and there's here's this group that can really nurture me and witness me in
Hmm.
that process.
Hmm.
And so it was like, yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
tonight I just need to like do these things every day, and
Yeah.
cry and
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
tea. um
What were some of the things that you found that were helpful, I guess, at that point, post miscarriage with the endometriosis, that were, really supportive for you?
Yeah. I found the Endometriosis Foundation of America. I think it's Endometriosis Foundation of America. Uh, and they have tons of resources on their
Mhm.
website. And I was able to find groups, different support groups, and connect with other women where we
Mhm.
were like on calls together and, telling our stories. And it was just so nurturing and supportive.
Mhm.
I didn't think I would be able to find something like that. So
Mhm.
specifically for me, that I really needed that. And everyone had experiences of different kinds of struggles and loss and pain, and just this ongoing kind of confusion web that
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
endometriosis of,
Mhm.
how do I kind of navigate life with this? And then I started taking some, there was a combination of like workshops of like around loss, early loss, and miscarriage, and holding space for yourself, and then learning to hold space for others, because
Mhm.
I think it took me a while to step into that holding space for others. There was a good
Mm.
year where it was just how to hold space for myself.
Yeah, you're like, "I don't have that capacity, thanks anyway." Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. You're
Yeah.
gonna just cry on your shoulder, or
Yeah.
can you hold space for me, because
Mhm.
my nervous system's a wreck.
Mhm.
And so those were my two main kind of focus
Mhm.
areas for myself, was around miscarriage and grief, and around endometriosis, and kind of hormonal support with
Mm.
other folks that knew that
Mhm.
landscape.
Were there, dietary changes, any particular supplements or anything like that that you found was really useful for you?
Yeah. I kind of, after the 6 months, I was led into working with an endocrinologist, and the endocrinologist had all kinds of like very like factual information for me based on my blood work, and was able
Mhm.
to say, well, actually, your body is having flare-ups when it comes to dairy and alcohol and gluten, and
Mhm.
now I know that a lot of those are pretty common triggers for
Mhm.
folks with endometriosis,
Mhm. Mhm.
but you have to just unravel the layers. And
Absolutely. And you kinda have to hear sometimes that it's helpful with testing, right? To see on the
yeah,
test, like,
this is
okay,
your
this is like
body.
legit. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that was really, I think I needed that most of all.
Mhm.
Like, it wasn't just like a random suggestion that I read on the internet. It was like,
Right.
here's your blood work, here is
Yep.
your body, and this
Yep.
is how your body's responding to some of these things. So
Yep.
like, one by one started weeding out those to see, okay, well, how is my body feeling now? And there was a huge shift and how I was feeling that pain each month, and tracking my cycles. Huge shift over the next year of like how I felt in my body, and how no more ovarian cysts, no more overgrown ovarian cysts. We all have ovarian cysts, but I was not reaching pain points of feeling that in my body. So that was huge.
Yeah. And first of all, I want to say it's awesome that you found an endocrinologist like that, right? Because they're not all that good. You know, like there's some great ones out there, but it can be lacking sometimes in their sort of expanded knowledge. But, you know, just for people listening, you know, I mean, I obviously talk about fibroids a lot, but in a lot of senses, ovarian cysts are kind of stemming from the same kind of place. And, you know, so much of why, I mean, dairy we know is inflammatory to many people's systems, you know, just it's just a sort of common thing with the casein in there, but particularly around hormones, it can kick stuff up. But, you know, I often go back to, how is your body detoxifying or metabolizing estrogen, right? Because if it's not able to do that well, that is when we have what I call growths, like fibroids and cysts and polyps and things like that in our, you know, reproductive system. And so, you know, something like cutting out alcohol, because the liver has to detoxify alcohol first and foremost. You know, your hormones get pushed to the back of the line, and particularly estrogen, we really want to make sure it's being metabolized or detoxified well. So you cut out that alcohol, then that helps estrogen move up, you know. Gluten has such an inflammatory reaction for so many people too, and that inflammation, you know, impacts the processing. So it's all of this, like, you know, people were like, oh, that's just a fad to like cut these things out, but it's like, it's a very direct, you know, correlation to how our hormones are working in our body.
Yeah, absolutely. It just keeps going. And, you know, and I do know that I've had doctors since you know, you could have a drink here and there. It's not going to totally throw you over. But it was easier for me to just cut it out, and then I could lost the taste for it. And, you know, I'm like, I'm good. You know, I'm really okay without that.
And honestly, there's so many studies coming out right now about how even any amount of alcohol really isn't good for us. You know, it's not good for our brain health. It's not good for lots of different things. And so, I mean, I drink occasionally, and I'm not telling people to not drink at all, but I can see, you know, for a lot of people, it is just easier to kind of cut it out across the board, because it's an easy, slippery slope, right? You're like, you have one, and then you're like, you're like, that was okay last night, so I'll have one tonight, you know, and there you go.
Totally.
Yeah. So, okay, so you made those changes, and then you started to, you know, really calm down. So at this point, you know, you basically, the only surgery that you had done was the laparoscopic surgery, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So you haven't had to have hysterectomy.
I have not, but it has been suggested again and again.
It continues to be
especially now that I'm 38. It wasn't as much, and you know, when I was younger, they really don't suggest that. But once you go over 30, they're like, well, have you thought about, you know, like, you're old now. It's like,
you shouldn't be having kids anyway, so let's just take it out. It's the only purpose for it being there. Yeah.
Totally.
So do you still have some issues coming up with it monthly at this point?
You know, it's not like a perfect, like, oh, now I'm like smooth sailing and everything.
It's an autoimmune disorder, so it's like, it's there.
And I've done so much like kind of genealogy and family history, unpacking aspects of like hypothyroidism runs in the women in my family as well. So we have chronic kind of underactive thyroids. Surprise, you know.
Surprise. Yep.
So like, how do I meet that aspect of what hormonal regulation in my body is a whole other aspect that I had to kind of like learn to sort out. And then the nervous system regulation, I noticed, especially like looking to my mom, you know, your family's your greatest teachers, and you know, this tendency to be more like in an activated state. And maybe that's, you know, I've thought of it in so many different ways, but Irish lineage and working class, you know, people
Sure. Mm-hmm.
that were kind of hardwired to be like, let's go, let's go,
Yep.
go. And that kind of constant triggered state
Mm-hmm.
also lends itself to this, you know, system,
Mm-hmm.
hormonal system that's like triggering all these responses in my body. So
Right, right. And I also talk about this a lot for people, but if people don't know, our endocrine system, really, if you think about it, the big aspects of it are our ovaries, in those of us that can reproduce, and then our thyroid and our adrenals, right? And it's all controlled essentially in the brain. The brain is the one giving all the signals, and your body is always going to focus on keeping you alive first and foremost. And so that is where, if we're in that stress response, that fight, flight, or freeze response, that sort of nervous system up here, there's a focus. Your brain's like, all right, we're keeping you alive. We're pumping out that cortisol, and we're going to what we call down regulate your sex hormone production in your ovaries, right? So this is why I always talk about, first and foremost, when you're working with hormonal issues, you've got to work essentially with your adrenals. You've got to work with your nervous system, because you can't skirt around it and make your estrogen and progesterone work like perfectly. It's like it comes back to that again and again. And I think the point that you made, like the genealogy is such a huge, important part, the specific genetics, and how we actually process stress in our DNA, is hugely important. And we live in a culture that is constant go, 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 and really elevates that, right, in so many ways. And so it's tough to kind of go against the grain and do much relaxing or taking
totally.
time off or any of those kinds of things. So it's like you have all of those places to consider, along with trauma. We do know, that trauma lives in our tissues essentially, and can cause that too. So these are all, places worth looking at.
Yeah, no problem. Good luck.
Yeah. Right.
You
Got
know,
that taken care of in like a week. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
yeah,
So in other words, it's a constant process.
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So tell us more about, the work that that you're doing now. I mean, there's such a, as we kind of talked about before we got on, it's like you really crafted your own way rather than kind of going the traditional route in terms of maybe, healthcare training. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it kind of just became me after a while, the way this does, you
Yeah.
know, where you're like, well, now I'm on a healing journey as I continue to explore all of these things. I need more space in my life for
Hmm.
healing and regulating, and I naturally want other people to have that too,
Hmm.
you know.
Hmm.
And so in weaving all these threads, I did a lot of trainings and kind of poured myself into my work for for the first year and a half, and I'm still doing training. It's probably always, always learning,
Hmm.
um, but kind of crafting of approaching, well, how do we hold these things together? How do we
Hmm.
hold space for loss and trauma and grief? How do we process and integrate culturally? How do we make space for it?
Hmm.
And what is my approach to navigate that so it feels a little bit less just like we're in an emotional sea, you know?
Hmm.
And so,
Hmm.
yeah, so I did a lot of studying in somatic polyvagal theory, body based. How do we come back into our body? How do we access our own felt sense of embodiment? And pairing that with my background in communications, of course, and studying narrative medicine of how do we tell our stories? How do we come vulnerably, with our stories to a space where we feel safe and held and can co-regulate our
Hmm.
nervous system with another regulated nervous system in a safe space.
Hmm.
And so kind of partnering those things to find a way through, and how I hold space
Hmm.
for one person and for groups, and I love both of those for different reasons. I love one-on-one space because you really get that co-regulation, and you can really like dive deep with one person and their nervous system and their trauma. And in group spaces, there's a really beautiful like shared felt sense that everyone to touch and hold and realize like, oh, we're all having like vastly different and similar experiences, you know?
Yeah.
So
Wow. And then where does the doula part come in?
yeah. The doula work started as grief doula work naturally, and wanting to hold space for other birthing people that have had early loss and experienced child loss. And so realizing that there wasn't a in-person space in my community where folks could feel represented and held and seen, like where is there a place I can go? And that was what I was looking for, you know, for so long. Where do I go with this? You know,
Yeah.
there's crisis centers everywhere.
Yeah.
But there's no place that I can see. Mental health therapists, perhaps,
Right.
but I couldn't really find that in between of like, well, I have a therapist, they're wonderful, but you know, where is a place that I could go and have someone that really knows this experience and with me and feels, you know, within the vein of you know, as me as a naturopath and someone that holds my life and my values in a certain way, someone that could really hold all of those things. So grief doula work was how the doula work all started.
Yeah. And I think it's so important. And the reason I brought up doula specifically is because I think a lot of people think, oh, just doula is you're there in the hospital to help, you know, a person give birth or support them in their birthing process. But there's all kinds of doulaing, right? Like, you know, the postpartum doulaing and all of that. And it makes me think about, you know, how it was done for most of all of time, right? In terms of you know, traditional cultures in general. I don't want to say overall, you know, traditional cultures, but probably even you know, in European cultures, it was like women were, I mean, until we had quote unquote Western medicine developed in, you know, the mid 19th century. Um it was really women that were doing the birthing and supporting each other in that birthing process, you know, and so we really have lost that sort of community connection, right, and support, which I think is partly why it's so hard to just, even if you have a healthy baby,
Yeah.
it's so
Yeah.
hard in this culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what led into postpartum was like, well, everyone's holding this like grief,
Yeah.
you know, in a
Yep.
different way of,
Right.
well, maybe you did have a child, but now there's this like loss of a sense of self and where do I
Yeah.
fit and what is my new life now? And,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of the tools are
You're
this.
depleted as hell because you just gave birth.
Totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So like a lot of the tools I found are the same, you
Right.
know. Some are very specific, and yet a lot of them are very similar. Like, how do we come back into ourselves? How do we hold ourselves? How are we held by
Mm-hmm.
someone else to help even find that, oh, this is what I need, or
Mm-hmm.
this is my felt sense of my needs, or just giving you time to rest and be with
Mm-hmm.
yourself, you know,
Mm-hmm.
which is like such an honor to hold that space and to help someone find that um, for themselves.
Is it ever hard for you having gone through, you know, the experience that you went through?
Yeah, people ask me that a lot, and I mean, hell yeah,
Yeah.
it is. You know, I have to have my own space. I hold a lot of healing space for myself
Yeah.
to, you know, not take on other folks' stories and
Right.
to really process out after I've held space with someone and kind of clear my own energy and come back into myself. So like, you know, it's interesting doing this work. Is like it requires so much more space held for yourself
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, to navigate holding that for other people.
Right. Right. And I think that's really important for, you know, any maybe newer practitioner that's listening. Because any kind of practice where you're really trying to be there for someone else and hold space for others, like it can be, even if it's not triggering per se, it can be super draining. And so it becomes more important to set up these these systems for yourself, whatever kind of support that you need from elsewhere, and what you need to do to kind of, let go of the stuff that you sort of maybe take on in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And making sure that you aren't somehow like imprinting that on someone else,
Right.
my own experience, that I can show up. Because I won't show up if I feel like I emotionally can't, or, my nervous system can't take it,
Yeah.
then, I'll let someone else know, hey, I need to reschedule, or let's do this
Mhm.
another day.
Mhm.
Because equally as important is that you have someone that can show up for you and isn't shared, right? Or because
Yeah.
then you're with a friend. That's what happens when you're with a friend. It's just,
Right.
we relate. We want to
Right.
relate.
Right. Right. Right.
But as a
Absolutely.
practitioner, you're showing up as someone with a regulated nervous system
Mhm.
that can just hold what you're bringing to the table and help
Mhm.
navigate. How do we move through this? How does this feel? That
Mhm.
is holding space for someone to process and be with that grief and
Mm.
explore that grief. And
Mhm.
yeah.
And I'm glad that you brought up sort of your modeling and letting people know that, that you can say, today's not working for me. Can we reschedule? I think this is such an important thing, that's coming up in discussions more recently, right? We were such in this like hustle mode for so long. And I know within my own business, like, there's so many times where it's like, I really right now I'm not going to do my best, right, to like show up, but I did, and and that's fine sometimes, but really I like that we're moving into honoring that, and saying I want to do the best for both this other person and myself. So, today's not it. Let's reschedule, and that's more
Yeah.
than okay to do.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's hard because it's like flying in the face of capitalism,
Yep.
and
Yep.
like, well, this is our culture, and so
Yep.
how do I make space in a society that's saying that's not how like
Yep.
that's not how you do
Absolutely. Yeah.
it.
It's radical work, really,
Yeah,
and it's not
yeah.
easy. So, props to talking about it and modeling it. So, at this point, are you able to get pregnant if yeah, okay. So is that
Yeah,
something that you're
yeah,
still
me
considering?
and my husband are trying right now,
Okay.
actually, and seeing if
Speak of
that's
the devil. Just
possible
kidding.
for us. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're just going to see where that leads us. We have kind of a time
Mhm.
limit on how much time we're going to spend there, and
Mhm.
for our own nervous systems and well-being,
Yeah.
that and we already know kind of like how we want to navigate that, and what we feel like we want to do and don't want to do,
Mhm.
and then if it turns out that we can't, then then we'll take a big trip to Hawaii, and and move on with
Yeah.
our experience. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but interestingly, so many people told me, no, you can't. No, you can't at all after these experiences that you've
That
had.
you couldn't get pregnant? You had
Mhm,
doctors telling you that?
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're too old.
Mhm.
Your ovarian cyst, your endometriosis,
Mhm.
all these things.
Right.
Impossible. Like, don't
Right.
even think about it.
Did you come across a doctor that said, "Oh, it is possible,"
Yeah, I
finally?
found
Yeah.
a great gynecologist that, wa was like, it is very possible,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
can run all the tests and basically show you why it is very possible. And
Right.
there's a lot of different ways that can happen. So
Yeah.
let's see if that's possible for you. And
Yeah, I find it so interesting because I think, just the starting at that place of, "Oh, you're over 35," right? They're
Mhm,
already telling you, even though that's really not based, I mean, it's so individual, right?
mhm,
It's not based in any kind of real fact, but, then, yeah, they're like, "Oh, we're just looking at this, what you've been through, and so it's not gonna happen," rather than, really look at the specifics of what's happening in your body. And again, that's
yeah,
where testing can be really helpful, right? And really
yes.
show you,
Mhm.
instead of just discarding based on sort of your past history and everything. And yeah, I mean, and all the work that you do to take care of yourself, I mean, it's amazing what the body can do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is. And, it's interesting how much that kind of like over that very generic kind of chart read, and then a
Hmm.
dismissive, answer is given, and it's like, well, what are you basing that on?
Yeah.
You know?
Yep. Right. Right.
And
It's
that
their own
with
preconceived
a doctor.
notions. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That it may be hard for them.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know?
Or you've just learned to give that answer based on looking at these, like you said, based on looking at, oh, you're over 35, you've had endometriosis, you've had a miscarriage, no, it's just not
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this incredible information with us today. I know that, there's certainly some people listening that can identify with some of what you've talked about. And at first let's say, how can people work with you if they're interested in working with you?
Yeah. You can reach out to me. I have my website that's more around my writing work and
Mhm.
communication work is TiffanyNarron.com. But A Light in the Valley is all of my resourcing work around somatic practices. So I do one-on-one sessions with women and birthing persons and grief work sessions. And I host some monthly workshops that I announce on my Light in the Valley Instagram page. So
Nice. And can people work with you wherever they are, kind of a thing, or does it need to be
yeah, I'll hold
locally?
virtual sessions.
Okay.
I'm moving studios right now. I was in Mars Hill for quite a bit, but I'm changing studio spaces. So virtually is primarily my mode right now. I do have a lot of upcoming in-person workshops. If you're in Western North Carolina, I'm holding some spaces and different wellness facilities, and those are all listed on my website too.
Nice.
If you want.
Great. Well, thank you so much for doing this work, because I think, it's certainly, as we talked about earlier, when we go through these our own experiences, often it will lead us into doing that kind of work, supporting others, but it doesn't mean it's easy,
Right. Yeah.
and so I think a lot of people, they're like, oh, you came out of this horrible situation and now you're doing this amazing work in the world. I know I hear that all the time. And I'm like, yeah, it's not like pretty and clean and all, perfect like that sounds, it's like I will always deal with some of the repercussions of what I went through, and how that impacts me. And that, plays into work too. So it's like, you got to keep on, as we've talked about, you got to keep on doing the healing work for yourself. It isn't just like, oh, we're done with that hard stuff.
Right. Right.
Everything's fine now. Yeah. I
Totally.
wish. But
Yeah. Right.
yeah. So that's the real deal, everybody. All right. Well, thank you again for being here with us today.
Having
And
me.
I will see you all next week.